Hi there, I'm Doy Santos, and you're on the Cusp. Today on the Cusp, we're going to be delving into a question that is probably on the minds of many Filipinos today. And that question is, can President Duterte avoid the pitfalls of Marcos? Now, it's quite a timely question to ask because it's only been a month since protesters marched on the streets of Manila denouncing President Duterte for following in the footsteps of Marcos during the anniversary of September 21, which was when President Marcos proclaimed martial law in the Philippines back in 1971. The period following the collapse of President Marcos's regime was a traumatic experience for the nation. So much so that in 1986, people on EDSA cried, "Never again." Yet 30 years after, a new generation has reminded us why it's wise never to say the word never, as they helped install what a person whom many regard is, the second coming of President Marcos in Malacanang. He was elected with less than 50% of the vote. However, a year after assuming office, a Pew survey showed that about 86% of Filipinos approved of his performance on the job. A recent survey last September, in fact, showed that trust in the president still remained in the low 70s, which is a remarkable statistic, given the fact that there have been thousands of murders and killings under his war on drugs. And many have denounced this. And despite all the criticisms hurled at him, he still seems to retain a very high trust rating. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be that surprising, because when President Marcos declared martial law back in 1971, that proclamation was actually met with relief by most Filipinos. The business community, for one, was relieved that order and predictability had been restored. Our Western allies were glad that they had a very strong ally in the Philippines who was going to suppress communism. The Catholic Church also felt the same. People in general had gotten tired of the chaos of the post-war republic. So much so that if you probably conducted a poll in, say, September 1972, a year after the declaration of martial law, President Marcos's popularity ratings would have probably been similar or be the same as what President Duterte's ratings are today. So it shouldn't really be surprising, given that fact. Buyer's remorse settled only much later in the piece. And this was, again, despite the thousands of arrests, the thousands of forced disappearances that occurred during the martial law period. Now, that doesn't mean that President Duterte's ratings are going to remain as high as they are today. As the case of Ferdinand Marcos illustrates, you can go from being, very popular to being very unpopular within a short period of time. Now, I know that asking this question, can Duterte avoid the pitfalls of Marcos, can be quite controversial amongst Filipinos today. On the one hand, you'll have those that will say, why are we even asking this question, right? We already know the answer. Duterte is the second coming of Ferdinand Marcos. All right, he already has fallen into the pitfalls that Marcos had um, had fallen into. So, we don't even need to discuss that. On the other hand, there will be those that say, well, President Marcos wasn't actually such a bad president. Instead of asking whether Duterte can avoid the pitfalls of President Marcos, we should probably be asking, well, why can't he follow in President Marcos's? Why can't he succeed and as President Marcos did? So I know that this question is depending on which end of the political spectrum you're at, can be upsetting to some of you. But what I would like to ask is, at the moment, let's just suspend judgment for a while, because what I would like to do is, rather than arguing from a certain assumed standpoint, what I'd like to do for us here is to just try and look at the sequence of events that have unfolded, and maybe that would unlock a broader perspective on the whole thing. Let's try and suspend judgment and really look at the evidence, if you will, in answering this question. So if we leave all of those objections to one side for a moment, one thing can't be denied, and that is when President Marcos fled the country in 1986, he did so because much of the military, much of civil society, the Catholic Church, the lay people, and his allies in Washington had enough of him. And aside from that, we can look at a bunch of indicators that point to basically collapse in our economy that led to a decade-long stagnation. We can look at, for instance, per capita GNP and how that suffered a period of prolonged stagnation from the early 80s all the way up to the late 90s. This came about because of the debt crisis that President Marcos got mired in. The level of indebtedness at that time prevented the government from funding basic services like education and health. The IMF had to bail the Philippines out, provide assistance, but then set very stringent austerity measures as a precondition for providing liquidity to our country. The conflicts in the South and with the communists erupted during President Marcos's time in office. The military adventurism that followed 86, it started in 86 and followed after that, frightened away investors and bred instability. And this happened because the military had developed a taste for power under President Marcos. The human rights violations that occurred during the time of President Marcos, which resulted in a lack of cohesion in our society. We can look at all these indicators that occurred during that time. And then I'm about to make a very big concession here. I'm going to say, if we only ascribe part of the blame to President Marcos and say that he was responsible, he was only in part responsible for these traumas that afflicted our country, that's the concession. Many people would just blame him totally, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he wasn't totally responsible for all of them. He was only in part responsible. Even if we concede that, then it's clear that the disenchantment of the people with him is partly deserved. Now you might argue, all this hatred towards the Marcoses is because of the indoctrination that occurred, that has been ongoing, under several yellow regimes. All right. So indoctrination aside, these indicators, took place right after he his time in office. And so, if we only ascribe part of the blame to him, then some of that disenchantment is probably deserved in some way or another. Of course, he might share the blame with others, but you get the picture. So then the question then becomes, can Duterte avoid the pitfalls that contributed to the collapse, to the decline of President Marcos's regime? So let's start with the first pitfall. That pitfall being a lack of accountability, or some would say lust for power. So lack of accountability was Ferdinand Marcos's first pitfall. Of course, we know history tells us at the end of his second and supposedly last term as president, he declared martial law in 1971. He then proceeded to amend the 1973 Constitution and took on legislative and, judicial power to stay on indefinitely. This made him accountable to no other political authority but himself. This led to a lack of checks and balances, which in turn led to a whole host of problems associated with his regime. We know the crony capitalism and corruption that took place. As the saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this was, of course, a major pitfall, because when you have no accountability, there's nobody there to tell you, hey, that decision you made, that probably wasn't the best, or even before you make the decision, no one's there to advise you not to go down that. No one's there to warn you not to go down that path. So in seeking to rule almost as a monarch who was not accountable to anyone, President Marcos fell into this major pitfall. So he did this, of course, because he wanted to stay in power. So he wanted to crush any form of dissent. He wanted to prevent the opposition from being able to unseat him. But in doing so, he lacked the dynamism that a vibrant democracy brings, where people can add their voices to, policy making. And so this was a major pitfall. Now, the question here is, does Duterte risk falling into the same trap? Now, as I said earlier, some people feel he already has, right? But before we jump to conclusions, I'd like us to examine the evidence for a second. Look at the train of events here. Earlier, in the middle of this year, President Duterte declared martial law in the south, in Mindanao, following the takeover of the city of Marawi by a group with links to Islamic State. This confirmed to many that Duterte had a thirst for absolute power, right? People were speculating prior to this that President Duterte would declare martial law in order to prosecute his war on drugs. It turns out that it was terrorism that brought this on. Not in the entire Philippines, but only on the island of Mindanao. But nevertheless, after he declared martial law, people said, see, we told you so. He was planning to declare martial law all along, and he's just going to use, these events. He's just going to manufacture, as President Marcos supposedly did, manufacture a rebellion in order to justify his proclamation of martial law, in order to get absolute power and be accountable to no one. And then they were afraid he was going to use the powers under martial law in order to commit even more violations, prosecute the war on drugs even more severely. Now, is that what happened? Is that what really unfolded? Is that what he got? Under the current constitution, of course, the powers exercised by the state under martial law are much more circumscribed than they were in the 1935 Constitution, which was kind of like open-ended. There were no constraints, no restrictions. In a blog post that I published at the time of the Marawi siege, I argued that civil liberties in Western nations like France and the UK, the United States, Australia, have even been more curtailed through their anti-terror laws than they are now under martial law in Mindanao. That's what I was arguing. Former Chief Justice Artemio Panganiban recently, in an article published in the Inquirer, argued the same point. And in that article, he said, and I quote, "To stress, under the present charter, martial law can be declared only to suppress an actual rebellion or invasion and no other crime, when public safety requires it." So it can't be used for the war on drugs, in other words. The Congress and the Supreme Court are separately authorized to review and to strike down the declaration. At all events, the Constitution, particularly Article 3, the Bill of Rights, is not suspended and remains in full force. The only immediate adverse effect on the citizenry is the authority given to law enforcers to detain rebellion and invasion suspects for 72 hours instead of the usual 36 hours. And this can be done only if the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is also suspended. End of quote. Now, I'd like to use that quote from Chief Justice Panganiban and compare that with the situation in Australia, where the Commonwealth governments, the Commonwealth, all the various state governments and the federal government had just met over the weekend to discuss increasing the length of time that terror suspects can be held without charge from 7 days to 14 days, and to include children under the age of, children 10 years and above. Under that law, they can be held because supposedly some minors have been used in connection with some terror plots. So in Australia, in the Philippines, under martial law, only under martial law, you can be held, if you are a terror suspect, you can be held for a period of 72 hours under martial law. In Australia, they've just agreed to extend that period from 7 days to 14 days, a whole fortnight, right? Without charge. In the UK, anyone may be held for 28 days without charge under their terror laws. And there doesn't need to be a state of emergency or martial law for that to happen. It just happens, under normal circumstances. And in France, under their state of emergency, terror suspects may be held indefinitely. That's settled in. You can be held indefinitely in France under their state of emergency, which was put in place since November 2015, and Macron extended it after he got elected president. So, unlike martial law under President Marcos, under Duterte, Congress has remained open and was in fact able to validate the legitimacy of his proclamation of martial law. It was a little controversial, but both the upper house and the lower house, through separate resolutions, validated the proclamation. The Supreme Court reviewed the proclamation and issued a decision on the validity of the proclamation as well. The Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ensured as well that the lower courts in Mindanao remained open to hear cases of, abuse, potential abuse martial law powers if civil rights would be violated in such illegal searches and that sort of thing. So despite all the fears that the coverage of martial law would be spread across the entire Philippines, this hasn't happened. Now, with respect to his war on drugs, people thought, oh, he's going to use these powers, to prosecute the war on drugs. Duterte has, of course, been accused of being a law unto himself. However, the Senate still was able to investigate incidents of abuse by the police. Even the president's son was not spared. He was dragged into one of these committee hearings. Allegations of his involvement in the drug trade and in the smuggling trade were brought forward. The media covered this. And afterwards, the deaths of 3 teenagers at the hands of police operatives was reported in the papers. It was alleged it had been captured on CCTV cameras, leading to further investigations, which led to the suspension of an entire police district in Caloocan. President Duterte vowed to jail any police members of the police who were found to have broken the law. And so this demonstrates that even under the present conditions, right, President Duterte still has been made to account, right? There's still a sense of accountability. The institutions are working in order to provide some checks and balance. The Commission of Human Rights, which has been very critical of him, they threatened to defund it because he was looking to develop the case and bring it before the appropriate courts. That funding has been reinstated by the Senate and by the House. Its chairman entered into an agreement with the Speaker of the House for the funding to be released, to be appropriated. Then there's the jailing of Senator Laila de Lima, which many regard as proof that the president is hell-bent on silencing his critics. However, despite her imprisonment, Senator de Lima has continued to have full access to the media, which he uses to denounce President Duterte almost on a daily basis. And she is having her day in court, and it's not a military court, mind you, it's a civilian court, right? Where she can actually argue her case. Of course, it's ironic that that Senator de Lima is in this predicament because during her time as Secretary of Justice, one could say that the Justice Department was also used to prosecute political opponents, chief being the former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was arrested despite a Supreme Court, who was barred from leaving the country and then arrested despite a temporary restraining order being issued by the Supreme Court. Senator de Lima chose not to follow that TRO and proceeded with apprehending the Congresswoman, former President Gloria Arroyo. And it's quite ironic that now the Justice Department again is being used to prosecute cases of, some say they're very weak cases, manufactured cases, but nevertheless the Supreme Court ruled that the government still had the right to prosecute her in the regional trial court, not in the Sandigan Bayan, but in the regional trial court for the common crime of drug peddling. Now, that case is very controversial. We won't go into the merits of that case. What I just like to point out here is that, the situation under President Duterte is far removed from what it was under President Marcos, right? The press remains free to report incidents of abuse. Congress has remained free to exercise its oversight powers over the police and the conduct of his war on drugs. The courts remain open to hear cases, and its members seem able to rule without fear or favor. And ordinary citizens are allowed to vent their anger, on social media without fear of reprisal or being, brought to prison, as is the case in a lot of our neighbors, Singapore or Malaysia, where bloggers have been imprisoned for merely criticizing the government, albeit using some very abusive language. I mean, you can do that in the Philippines without really any fear, of being hurled into prison. Probably might just at worst face a libel charge, but at least it's not complete repression, right? So I mean, that's just the law. If you break the law, then of course other people have the right to sue you if you libel them. So and recently the president has withdrawn the PNP as lead agency for the war on drugs, which kind of shows that he feels he's still in a way accountable for, he's still responding to the public, to the public's sense of mistrust or criticism or dissent hurled at him. He's listening. He's willing to back away from that war, from his initial position. Now, of course, he threatened to declare a revolutionary government if his back is pressed against the wall, if people try to destabilize him, if, all these so-called plots by foreign governments or wealthy businessmen who are being chased for their unpaid taxes materialize. He says, you better watch out. Of course, if he did that, and many of his supporters are backing that, he should declare a revolutionary government. If he did that, this would unleash him from the constraints placed that are in place under the 1987 Constitution and effectively give him a free hand to rule as an autocrat for a period of time. But how serious is that threat? How serious can we take Duterte as at his word that he's going to declare a revolutionary government? Well, time will tell, but normally if you have to broadcast such a threat, right? If you broadcast that, I'm going to declare a revolutionary government before doing it, it probably means you're not going to do it, right? Which kind of indicates that Duterte's bark is probably much fiercer than his bite. I mean, President Marcos's plan to declare martial law, Oplan Sagittarius, he probably spent 7.5 years preparing for that ultimate proclamation, for that ultimate event, right? He prepared the military, he developed loyalties, he promoted people whom he could trust, who were loyal only to him. And of course, under the constitutional framework that time, if he declared martial law, the military had to back him up. Currently, under our constitution, the role of the military is quite different. It's not only to defend the state, but also to defend the people. And this proposition was tested in the war on drugs when President Duterte tried to pull in the armed forces to participate in the war on drugs. And some of the generals said, there was a little bit of pushback. They said, hang on, that's not really our role. And so the question is, if President Duterte were to declare a revolutionary government, would the military back him up? That's the question, right? Given all those things that I've just said. So will he or won't he? My feeling is that President Duterte is behaving like a father, a disciplinarian, like a father trying to discipline a child. He's whipping out the finger and telling him, "You better watch out. Don't do that, or else you're gonna get a spanking. You're gonna get a spanking. You're gonna get grounded. Don't do it." So he's issuing that threat so that he doesn't have to act. I feel that's the sense that I'm getting. So in that sense, in terms of falling into the trap that Marcos fell in, which is a lack of accountability and lust for absolute power, President Duterte, after all I've just said, is probably not there yet. He hasn't fallen into that pitfall, despite all the denunciations, all the acrimony that people raise, that he's a dictator, he's a strongman, he's an authoritarian, etc. He hasn't actually fallen into that pitfall. He still is able to recalibrate his war on drugs. He remains somewhat accountable. He knows, because people have told him, he's made some missteps. And so they're trying to correct, they're trying to rethink, rejig that war on drugs now. So, and people are still free to express that to him. So he hasn't really fallen into that pitfall yet. He may over time, but as of now, there are still some restraints on him. Of course, it's still early days, but that's where we're at, I believe, at this point. So that concludes the first installment of this series on whether Duterte can avoid the pitfalls of Marcos. We'll be continuing with this question in subsequent episodes in a second part. So please stay tuned, and in the meantime, please leave a comment. Feel free to share this with your friends on social media. Our social media handles are appearing there on your screen and in the links below this podcast. So this has been another edition of the Cusp. Look forward to seeing you again. Take care. Till next time, this is Doy Santos signing off.